So let's start with the president's tweet the other day, or the president-elect's tweet the other day. Somebody, I forget who, said that he was going to declare a national emergency and use the military to, to do the mass deportations. And I'm doing this from memory, so correct me if I get the details wrong.
So far, perfect.
And he quote tweeted it with like a right or absolutely or
it was like true with 3 exclamation points, all in caps,
right.
in classic
So
fashion. That's right.
Extra true.
Extra true. That's correct.
So, and what he didn't mention is that there already is a national emergency, and that, to the extent that there's border enforcement going on, it already does have military support. So before we get to what Trump is planning to do and what the legal authorities are for it, let's pause a moment over the status quo.
Great.
Right? What is the current legal regime that is governing not immigration, but border enforcement stuff?
Fantastic. Right. So you're totally right. There is a national emergency right now about the drug trafficking crisis. It is generically stated, so it's not with respect to the southern border in particular. But with that said, it makes available to the Secretary of Defense a statutory authority to bring reservists, including National Guard folks, from an inactive to an active duty status much more quickly than you can under like a steady state kind of a situation. And the military folks, of which there are about 2,000, who have been mobilized under that statutory authority, are all at the southern border, and they're all supporting CBP. And they've been operating in this fashion for the entirety of the Biden administration. They were operating in this fashion for the entirety of the Trump administration. And indeed, there have been military at the southern border supporting the Department of Homeland Security, under a national emergency kind of a framework or otherwise, for most of the past 2 decades. So, as you say, no surprise whatsoever that some number of military are going to be at the border supporting DHS's immigration enforcement efforts.
So is it fair to conclude from that the proper amount of freak out associated with, I want to calibrate people's freak out levels here, that the mere fact of declaring a national emergency and using the military involves exactly 0 marginal freak out on its own terms?
Absolutely correct. That's right.
All right. So let's talk then about what would be different under presumably the national emergency as Trump describes it, and what added authority declaring a national emergency gives you, if any.
Great. Yeah. So I think there are 2 ways in which what we know of his plans would be quite different from kind of the steady state situation that we've seen over the past 2 decades. So first is using the military for law enforcement actions, right? So even in the Trump administration, the National Guard who were sent to the border weren't doing law enforcement functions. This was notwithstanding the fact that they were in this like weird hybrid duty status where they could do law enforcement functions, right? Because as a baseline proposition, military personnel can't enforce the law, and that's because of a statute called the Posse Comitatus Act, unless there is a constitutional or statutory exception. There is a particular weird personnel mobilization authority under which the National Guard in particular can remain in their state status and get around the Posse Comitatus Act while still doing a federal mission. It's a gigantic loophole. It's a significant problem. But putting that problem to the side, even in the Trump administration, right, the National Guard who were in this status weren't doing law enforcement functions. everything that we've seen suggests that there, at least some number of National Guard will likely be doing a law enforcement function in this second Trump administration.
And pause there.
Yeah.
First of all, why do we know this? And secondly, what is functionally the difference between a National Guard performing a law enforcement function and National Guard performing some other function in support of a law enforcement function, which is what they've been presumably doing so far?
That's right. Great. So a couple of things. So one, I think we can kind of read between the lines of how he's thinking of using the military to support these law enforcement functions, right? So he's been talking about using the military to arrest and detain migrants. So those are all necessarily law enforcement functions. Something that's not a law enforcement function that National Guard and other military have been doing in the past, right? So a few examples. There are historically frequently been military in kind of like a Jeep kind of a setup. They have really high-powered binoculars. They're stationed along the border at some distance from the Mexican border, and they're just looking. Do they see someone crossing the river? Or do they see someone crossing the border? If they see someone, they get on effectively the phone with a CBP agent in their sector and say, "Hey, I just saw four folks come across the border, right over here." The CBP agent comes and arrests them, right? And then brings them over to a CBP or ICE detention facility to detain them, right? So the National Guard folks, the military folks, are not doing any of the actual arresting, right? They are just doing the kind of detection and monitoring. That's right. Exactly. Right. And so that's what the military has traditionally done at the southern border. I think what we've seen in Trump's public statements suggests a much more robust use of the military, actually going forth and perhaps arresting folks at the border, potentially even detaining folks for some period of time. And like I said, those are all necessarily law enforcement functions, which would be quite different from what we've seen so far.
All right. And there is this statute, the Posse Comitatus statute, that says you're not allowed to use the military for law enforcement purposes unless there's a statutory or constitutional permission. So what is the statutory or constitutional permission for this use?
Yeah, so this is fantastic because we actually don't have to look for either of those permissions for these National Guard folks because they get to get around the statute entirely. So the Posse Comitatus Act applies to the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force now as of 2021.
I just want to say that the Space Force application is really important because we've got, all kinds of law enforcement activities going on in orbit. And, you don't want the military enforcing the law up there.
You don't. No, you don't. No, that would be a terrible Star Trek episode. Guardians don't enforce the laws. It's really one of my favorite revisions to the Posse Comitatus Act. In any event, so these National Guard folks, when they're in this hybrid duty status, where they remain part of their state militia, but they're doing a federal mission, they're not actually part of the armed forces. They're not part of the Army, the Navy, or otherwise. And because they're not part of the armed forces, the Posse Comitatus Act just doesn't apply to them. This is, as I said, a gigantic loophole, right? Because there are hundreds of thousands of National Guard folks in the United States. They're often tied up in any number of other missions or their civilian duties. But it does mean that there are a lot of people who could be mobilized and do law enforcement functions without anyone having to even think about the PCA.
All right. So, and do we have an analog for that? Has anybody ever, deployed the National Guard? Because we love to run around and say these things are unprecedented. And then, somebody drags out, well, there was this time in, 1908 when, you know, so and so mobilized the National Guard for. So, what's the history of using the National Guard for law enforcement functions?
Yeah.
How unprecedented would this be, leaving aside whether it's legal? How unprecedented would it be for Trump to do that?
So having National Guard in this hybrid duty status at the southern border would not be unprecedented. Having them at the southern border doing significant law enforcement functions would be unprecedented.
And when you say would be unprecedented, how contingent is that on it being the southern border? I mean, is this
Right.
unprecedented that they would be doing law enforcement functions,
Great.
or is it unprecedented that they would be doing law enforcement functions at the southern border?
Beautiful. Yes. Yeah. So it's law enforcement functions at the southern border in like the past 50 years, I would say. Um, get past 50 years and honestly my history isn't as good. I wouldn't be surprised if the National Guard were I mean then the militias were used for these kind of activities. But there have been National Guard at the southern border in this hybrid status during the Bush, Obama, uh, and Trump administrations. They were, as I said before, right, like not doing much in the way of law enforcement functions, but they could have. So at least in like recent political memory, using this kind of duty status for National Guard would not be particularly unprecedented.
All right. So let's, so far, we have what seems like a fairly a significant, but fairly at the margins difference, right?
Right.
We've always had them there, at least in recent memory. They've always been there in support of a law enforcement mission, but they haven't taken part in the law enforcement equalities of the law enforcement mission.
Right.
Now they'll now they'll be able to do that. Why does this distinction matter from a civ-mil relations point of view or from an immigration policy? Is this something we should be running around like chickens with our heads cut off, worrying about? Or is it, hey, this is a guy who ran on tougher immigration enforcement. He's got 2,500 people down there who can be just looking through binoculars or who can be looking through binoculars and making stops. Why not use them? What's your freak out meter on that?
Yeah, so on this portion, it is kind of like if we're on like a 1 to 10 scale, probably somewhere around like the 5 to 7, variety. So like not particularly high, I think.
Well, 7's pretty high.
I
So
guess
what?
7 is on the, well, that's because like I'm on what remains unsure. What remains unclear is the extent of the law enforcement mission that these National Guard folks will be given.
All right. So
Because
talk about the range of possibility here.
great, because like you could imagine on the lower end, the National Guard being used as like a second layer of defense. So you have CBP agents in a particular sector. They are the first line of defense in arresting folks as they're coming across the border. And National Guard folks are there, perhaps at the ready, nearby, to provide an additional layer, right, of law enforcement support if they become overwhelmed, right? There was a history of relatively large, sometimes they were called migrant caravans, right? Large groups of people coming to the border all at once, overwhelming the relatively small number of CBP agents that were at the border, right? That I think kind of more kind of reserve force kind of posture would give me a little bit less pause, right? It's been done in the past. It's not them being at the border all of the time, doing the first interface with these migrants. On the high end, right, you could imagine something much more robust. You could imagine many thousands of National Guard taking primary responsibility for law enforcement functions along much more significant swaths of the border, where the National Guard are tasked with detecting and then detaining for some indefinite amount of time in a facility that's either like a CBP facility that's run by military personnel, or perhaps a temporary facility that the military has helped establish. And perhaps we can get to that other kind of portion of the national emergency at some point. Where again the military is tasked with the primary responsibility for uh, uh, containing, right, these migrants for again some indefinite period of time. And there, I think I would be much more concerned because there is much less history in the National Guard or really any military personnel doing any of these tasks. And so there's therefore less training, there's less familiarity, there's the risk for something going wrong just becomes much higher. And that
Although military units do detention operations
that's
a
true.
lot,
Yeah,
and they're
right.
mostly pretty good at it.
Mm-hmm.
A few notable exceptions over the last 20 years, but 25 years, but mostly they're pretty good at running detention operations. Is there any particular reason to think that they would, and it's not like, Homeland Security has run especially professional ones, right? Is there any particular reason to think that the military would do a worse job of it than DHS has done?
I think if given the time that they need to set up these facilities, not necessarily. My fear is that they won't be given enough time to set up any of these facilities, right? That he's going to come into office, declare an emergency, and then day 2, day 3 say, fantastic. Military, you're going to establish 6 holding facilities on your installations, and they have to be up and running in a week. There's isn't enough time.
That's a recipe for bad outcomes.
For disaster, right? I mean, it'll so I think there's that possibility. There's also the added complication that though the military runs detention facilities pursuant to kind of military laws and regulations and authorities all the time, these migrant detention facilities would be subject to any number of immigration law, right? Regulations and laws and court decisions, which frankly, I'd be surprised if anyone really at DOD knew very much about any of those ex ante.
There are consent decrees that have application.
Right.
All right. So let's move down into the detention space since we've kind of migrated, no pun intended there anyway.
Right.
One of the elements of what Trump is promising is that, and he frankly conflates border security here with interior enforcement. Right. Where they're going to do a giant roundup. And presumably a lot of that roundup is going to have an interior enforcement component since the migrants actually don't congregate for any length of time at the border, right? You either catch them when they're crossing or they show up somewhere else. And he's talked about having camps, which presumably are transitory facilities pending deportation. How much is this the same issue, and how much is this a different issue?
I think this is pretty significantly a different issue. So it's a different issue in at least 2 regards that occur to me. Right. So first is the question, right? To what extent, if at all, can the military assist with these interior roundings up, whatever, of migrants? So the statutory authority that authorizes DOD to support CBP at the southern border is particular both to the southern border and to CBP. So it would not be available for DOD to assist ICE, for example, in going around New York or any other city and finding migrants to bring to a detention facility. So that legal regime is just fundamentally different. It's also different, right, if we're thinking about whether the president might direct the Secretary of Defense to establish detention facilities on a DoD military installation. There is a separate emergency military construction authority that I would expect that the president makes available in his national emergency declaration. This is the same emergency construction authority that Trump made available in his first term to build border wall on military installations. Because of the very broad definition of military construction that prevails in Title X, it would also include any even medium-term use substantial tent facility that they might want to establish to house migrants on a DoD installation.
So really, we should think of two roundups, right? One is the roundup of people as they're crossing the border. That is presumably, it's not that much different from what's going on now, save that you would have National Guard being perhaps the backup, but perhaps the front line in much larger numbers, and you would have facilities in DoD facilities where you could house people pending deportation. Then a second roundup is the ICE interior stuff, presumably done in concert with state and local law enforcement. And that has no analog to what's going on now.
That's right. Yeah, not that I'm aware of whatsoever. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the authority to do these various building.
Right.
Your piece was really only about the border side. So listeners, bracket the whole interior enforcement side. That's a different conversation. I don't even know, Chris, whether you are the guy to have that conversation with. But in any event, It's beyond today's conversation.
Indeed it is.
So separate issue. We're talking here only about the border.
Yeah.
I confess that I am a little bit skeptical that you issue an executive order day one saying do all this stuff. Mostly U.S. forces don't build big detention facilities overnight. Deployments actually take a lot of time unless you're, it's like Iraq Desert Storm or something, right? The military can act quickly, but it usually doesn't. And by the way, this is not a mission that the military is going to be super pumped about. So what do you imagine? Let's leave aside litigation, which we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah.
But day one, it's January 21st. The Steve Miller press release / executive order lands on Trump's desk. He signs it with a big flourish. There's a White House signing statement.
Yep.
And then what happens?
Yeah. So I think, like you say, a lot of nothing for a significant period of time. And I think that's true both for sending more military to the border and potentially building detention facilities on a DoD installation. All
right, so let's talk about that in order.
Great.
First of all, why does it take, the president says military goes to the border to help with law enforcement and Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply, so they can arrest every single illegal who comes across the border.
Right.
Go.
Right.
Why does it not happen?
Because you have to find these National Guard folks, right? So, and this is the trick, even if the president invokes the Insurrection Act, which I know we haven't talked about, which is even an even faster way of getting folks onto active duty, but has a whole other set of problems. National Guard folks have a day job. And their day jobs are hard to get out of, and you have to determine whether they're amenable to being put on orders. They significant DoD missions also, like just steady state, right, rely on the reserve component and National Guard in particular, regularly, right? So a lot of these folks also have like regularly scheduled DoD federal missions that they're like planning on for the next, X number of years. So like it takes a certain amount of time just to find the people, right? In the requisite numbers.
And a certain number of time, meaning 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years.
I think on
What's
the order
the?
of weeks. Yeah, I think on the order of like days to weeks. Because the added complication to the calculus is that under this weird hybrid status, you need the governor's consent to provide his or her National Guard to the federal government for a federal mission. So you're really only going to be looking at the states with a Republican governor, right? So your pool is smaller, right, of folks to look at. And so that's just going to take a couple of days of sorting out. Then you need DHS or someone to articulate like the particular duties that you want these military folks to do. Because even the most, pro-MAGA Republican governor is going to want to know what their National Guard are doing, like in some significant level of detail, before giving them up to the federal government to do a federal mission. And I expect that will take a while as well, because you need enough people at DHS to be able to articulate, right? Dear DoD, here are the 5 things that I want your National Guard to do down here at the southern border. And so I actually think that will probably take longer than finding the number of National Guard that they want to deploy to the southern border. And so I think those are some of the practical reasons why you have a big splash on day one, and you probably don't see an actual deployment for at least another couple of weeks.
And then what about on the building side? I mean, the president doesn't care about conditions of confinement. In fact, you kind of get the sense that if it's a little bit cruel, that's not
right.
the worst optics in the world from his point of view.
Right.
But so you have a order to build a tent city with razor wire and all that jazz. Why is that a long-term proposition, and how long do you think that takes realistically?
Yeah, so I think, and I know we're not getting to litigation yet.
That's a whole. It's lawfare, man. We don't mention litigation in passing here.
Right, but like, I think that this takes even longer, right? So, you need so the emergency construction statute that I think he'll make available on its face is really favorable to the DoD, right? It allows DoD to build without regard to any other provision of law. So like all of your
environmental
NEPA
statutes.
and right, all the usual red tape, right? You can throw out the window. You have to affirmatively throw them out the window, but that doesn't take, forever. That's a short memo. What takes longer, right, is like, all right, so like, is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers going to like build the facility on their own, or are they going to bid this process out to have like a contractor build out the facility? I could imagine they want a contractor to build out the facility. They don't have to go through a competitive bidding process, but they do actually have to like bid it, right, to get someone to start doing the work. If they do it internally, they have to like procure the materials to do all of this stuff. To procure the materials, you need to find the money within the DoD military construction budget, right? So you have to decide, okay, if we're going to spend a couple $100 million to build this new city, what training facility are we no longer going to build? So we can take that money and move it to this new purpose. In the border wall context, that took a really long time, right? Because, presumably they aren't going to want to piss off Greg Abbott, right, or another Republican governor, right, and take away projects on military installations in a friendly state. And so, like, figuring out the both mission impacts and the political calculus of finding the money and then being able to actually deploy the money to do something takes a substantial amount of time. How long in the end is kind of hard to know because litigation kind of intervened even faster in the border wall context
Right.
than like actually implementing much of any of this. Um, but I would be shocked if it took less than a month.
All right, so let's talk about litigation then. Um, Presumably, when that executive order issues, the ACLU will tweet, "We'll see you in court," and
Right.
raise $1 million,
Yep.
and they will file, or some combination of groups will file immediate lawsuits. The statutory authorizations here are super broad, as I
Right.
read them anyway. Why is litigation a particular threat here in terms of slowing things down?
Right. So I don't think it's a threat ultimately, right? So I would be shocked if once this is appealed to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court decides that any of these contemplated uses of these authorities is contrary to, like, as you say, this very broad text. I don't think that's going to happen. But there are, I think, two things that slow this down. So first is that I think it's relatively easy to find a judge at the district court level who would enjoin DOD from kind of continuing to engage in the construction process. That's what we saw in the border wall litigation process. Um, and like once you start that, right, like litigation takes forever. You're many months out from even getting an appeals court, right, from allowing DOD to continue doing its thing while litigation is pending. And so I think that's the first kind of source of friction that results from the litigation. The second is if you are DOD and you want to succeed ultimately, you need to create a factual record that is substantial enough that the Supreme Court or another court can point to it and say, this is a proper use of this very broad authority, right? And we saw this in the border wall context, any number of declarations and affidavits with relatively detailed information about migrant flows, the connection of these projects to a military mission, kind of all of these kind of nitty gritty questions, right? And the process of compiling that factual record itself takes a substantial amount of time. So I think even just like the prospect of litigation also slows down the process. Of course, right, and so that also turns on a question of right the extent to which senior DoD leaders want to give their subordinates the time to put together that process, right? How scared they are of that appellate review. I have no idea what Pete Hegseth's relative, risk tolerance is on these. I don't know if he knows what his relative risk tolerance
Right.
is on these
I
things.
can venture the guess that he has not spent quality time thinking about this question.
Yeah, right. I would agree. And so I think it's a little bit up in the air how much of friction, right, that leads to the process. But I think it's at least a degree of friction.
All right. So when you put it all together, how soon does how much happen?
Yeah. So I think
Are we
that
talking about 6 weeks and then we have the National Guard, you know, catching people, putting them in camps, and, helicopters flying the people in the camps back to across the border? Or is it more like 6 months and things look kind of like they do now, with some, a few more National Guard doing a little bit more law enforcement-y stuff, and, by the way, some DHS facilities that have some military base for, detentions? How
yeah,
dramatically do you expect how much to change how quickly?
yeah. So I think within 1 to 2 months you have uh some degree, probably not insubstantial, but also probably not, 10,000 uh, additional military at the southern border, assisting in perhaps marginally more functions than they are currently, right? Assisting CBP with uh, immigration enforcement. That's what I expect to see in like in about a month. from declaration of national emergency. I would be
And this
shocked.
troubles you not very much.
Not particularly. No.
Okay.
And then listen, if I were them, and if like the bluster combined with the marginal increase in border enforcement leads to like significantly lower migrant flows at the southern border, I think there's a real world where like they declare victory, at least from a military involvement perspective, right? And
Right.
move on to something else.
We called in the military,
That's
and
right.
border crossings have dropped. Lots of people are saying they've never seen it this low.
That's right. And I think it's actually relatively easy. I could imagine it being relatively easy to create that narrative, right? With fewer additional resources than we might expect.
Especially because the rate of crossings is not all that high right
No.
now, and we're heading into a winter.
Right. I mean, like, I think, yeah, right. The flip on popular sentiment regarding the economy kind of occurs to me at the moment, right? And I think, I could see an analog, right, in this context. Part of me would be quite surprised to see DoD building migrant detention facilities on a military installation in anything faster than 6 months. I just between the litigation and the amount of time you need to actually put it together, and then the amount of time you need to figure out how the military would actually staff those kind of facilities, it's complicated legally, logistically, like, from the chain of command perspective, just like in almost every regard, super painful. So I'd be surprised to see much in the way of kind of that part of the equation in the first 6 months of the administration.
And so, given your stated expectations, how concerned do you? I mean, you said your concern was sort of between a 5 and a 7. I mean, do you look at this and say the sort of public reaction is kind of an overreaction to this, or do you say, hey, this is a significant change in U.S. use of the military in immigration and law enforcement purposes? People should be really concerned about this. Kind of, what's your level of what's your balance of, hey, calm down, we've been doing a lot of this stuff for a long time anyway,
Right.
and hey, this is a really important set of changes?
Yeah. So I think I am relatively less I think that the prospect for immediate action is sufficiently low that I think the kind of level of freakout is probably a bit too high at the moment. So I think that folks should be less concerned about what might immediately happen upon him kind of coming to office. If I am wrong, so like part of my 5 to 7 range of freakout is based on the risk that I'm wrong about what they're looking to do with the military, right? And like what they think is enough politically. Like it's I have difficulty getting into his head. So I think that there is I am concerned that over like the medium term, over the course of 4 years, we might see much more significant uses of the military because they'll have more time to plan them out, and that would concern me. So it's a.
And do you mean here at the border, or do you mean in, for example, dealing with protests or
Right.
dealing with interior enforcement stuff, when you're imagining more concerning domestic deployments?
Yeah.
What are you thinking about?
Yeah, so both, right? So the muscles that you exercise by deploying the military and the National Guard for these law enforcement missions at the southern border are pretty substantially the same ones that you need to use the military within the United States outside the immigration context. And so I think it's kind of like a slippery slope concern, right? Once we get used to even relatively more action at the southern border, it becomes practically, and I also think just politically, easier to use the military in aspects of daily life within the United States where we haven't seen a substantial role for the military in at least quite a long time.
So let's talk briefly about the Insurrection Act.
Yeah.
If you want to amplify this whole thing a little bit, you say Insurrection Act instead of national emergency, and we've got a different lens legally through which to look at the whole thing. What bearing does the Insurrection Act potentially have on this conversation, and how concerned should people be about it?
Yeah. So the Insurrection Act has like 3 substantive provisions, right? And they authorize the president, given certain conditions, different conditions for each of the statutory authorities, to use the military much more broadly, right? For to suppress domestic unrest, do law enforcement effectively, right? Think of them as any kind of federal law enforcement agency. That's effectively what they would become after an Insurrection Act invocation. Some of these authorities require a request from a governor. Some of them don't. There's a very broad one that does not require any request from a governor for support. I think it is not out of the question that he would use at least one of these provisions of the Insurrection Act. I don't know if it would be to deploy the military for immigration enforcement purposes or for other purposes as kind of events develop within the United States. And there are challenges in using the Insurrection Act for any kind of domestic deployment. Although the statutes are incredibly old and they have very broad language, they traditionally have been interpreted, including by the Department of Justice, as requiring a certain factual finding of local and federal law enforcement agencies being unable to control whatever domestic unrest we are currently concerned with. Right, so the last invocation was the 1992 LA riots, right? So the issue there was that LA Police Department, California state troopers, whatever federal law enforcement, were available in the area, weren't sufficient to quell the demonstrations, the unrest, the destruction that was happening in LA. That led the first President Bush to determine that it was necessary to use the military, right, to assist. These interpretations of very broad old language, I could very easily see, given a pliable Department of Justice, Trump kind of getting over practically quite quickly. My concern would be that litigation wouldn't be fast enough to do to meaningfully stand in the way of that kind of domestic deployment. It is also significantly like the nuclear option, right? It is the authority that provides the president the most expansive authority to use the military in the United States. And so if you ramp up to it too quickly, you're also left with nothing else in your rucksack, right? And so that's part of what makes me think that we're unlikely to see an Insurrection Act invocation immediately. But I have no way of knowing if that instinct is true. And I think that the guardrails here have in significant ways not been tested meaningfully because there's just been traditionally a reluctance of presidents to use Insurrection Act authorities.
We are going to leave it there. Chris Mirasola, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.